Last week, we started talking about how the Megillah is a problematic text from a religious point of view because it doesn't explicitly speak of what the message is of the holiday of the story. It doesn't tell you the why. Things are concealed without question. There's another book like that in the Torah, the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs is clearly written as love poetry, but it makes it into our canon, into the Tanakh, and is seen as sacred literature. And that's because the people that put it into the canon, our prophets, and then the ratified by the later sages, saw it as something more than just love poetry. They saw it as a metaphor for something. So we do have certain works like the Song of Songs, and then you have books like Proverbs, which are literally proverbs. In other words, they are written in a way that they will use language that is, if you will, secular or mundane, but it alludes to higher things. The great challenge in the Torah is we don't want to make the Torah into just a metaphor. That's what makes us Jews, is that we believe kosher means literally, not just what we eat. You know, someone could make a allusion and make symbols out of Adam and Eve, out of Abraham. And we do, in Judaism, we do make symbols, but the symbols are not at the expense of the literal meaning. The Torah, because it's from God, can be read on more than one level. And the Torah then, because it's godly, these levels do not contradict one another, but rather they complement one another. But because this text is seen as the word of God, there are different modes of approach. I'm just seeing if someone texts me about the class. Yeah, let me turn up my ringer. So the caution that we take is there were people in Jewish history and others that took stories of the Torah and made them just into symbols. That we don't want. But the fact that there's an extra layer that could be used as symbols is important as well. We spoke about 4 primary ways of biblical interpretation. Peshat is the simple meaning of the text. But even to understand the simple meaning of the text, at times you have to know the background. You have to know what the language it's using. And in particular, a book like Esther, like we said, was missing and is missing some of that explicit messaging that we need to make sense of the story, the why of the persecution and the why of the salvation and the religious nature of it. But even every literal interpretation, also because it's seen as part of something larger, you get to look at it like we did last week through the lens of other stories that are similar or direct motifs lifted from an earlier biblical book and using the exact same language to tell you something. So that is a little bit more allusion than literal. So already last week when we were doing the literal, the Book of Esther related to the story of Joseph is a little bit was allusions of the text. It's like someone making a tribute band, or they use language. If someone lifted language, let's say from the Declaration of Independence to declare, you know, in their high school to declare independence from the authorities and from the principal, and they lifted that language, there would be a reason for it. It would be evocative, and people would make that connection. Oh, it's freedom related. So people do this all the time, and the Torah does it. The Book of Prophets, in the book of our writings, sacred writings, books, the Book of Esther has a bunch, many like, not just the Joseph story. Some are more far out than others. We'll come back and we'll look at it. So when it comes to allusion, We're going to talk today about 4 types of allusions. Some are more closely related to the text itself. Others are just a springboard to talk about other things. In other words, using the biblical text as a metaphor for things that are not directly related. That's number 2. So number 1 is allusions to other biblical stories. Number 2 is going to be like a metaphor, to read a biblical story as a metaphor. Again, the Song of Songs is written like that. Even the story of Jonah, people have interpreted it as well as a metaphor for the human existence. So we're going to take a look at one writer who gives the whole Megillah as a metaphor for our struggles in our life. And again, it is taking a biblical text. The rabbi and the sage who composed this, he knew this wasn't the literal meaning. It was using a biblical text as a template to explain other biblical ideas, which is what the allegory is, when you take one text and you take it out of its literal meaning. Okay, then there's other allusions in text, which there are different, in the whole Torah, there are some letters that are large, written large, some are written small. And this is all from tradition going way back, some of them going back to Moses, others possibly to Ezra, but there are allusions in the size of the letters, in the shape of the letters, and there are allusions to not just outside the story, but in the story itself, as we'll see. But some of them can be read as predictions or codes in the Torah. When I say codes, we'll explore it. This is an ancient concept that the letters of the Torah have many layers of meaning. Okay, without further ado, let's jump in and we'll start. And I'm going to try 7:09. We have 50 minutes. I'll try to divide these subjects up accordingly. Share screen. Here we are. So I posted the direct link. I posted in the chat box if someone would rather, you could look at me fully and print out the text, or look at the text on another device, whatever you want to do. All right. So first is allusions to Esther in the Bible. In other words, this concept of allusion is that we could find hints in the Torah to things, in the 5 books. Everything is alluded to in the 5 books is the teaching. So the Talmud has a conversation, and they say, where can you find an allusion to Haman in the 5 books of Moses? And the Talmud says, if you look at the first story of the temptation of Adam and Eve and the sin of the Garden of Eden, the Hebrew says, Hamin ha'etz, did you eat from the tree? And the word Hamin, from, is spelled Haman. So here, it's an allusion that Haman is representing that first stumbling block of humanity. So this is a far-fetched symbolism, seemingly not directly related. We'll analyze 1 or 2 of these. I just want to show you the idea that you can have remez, allusion, in the text. But the next one is a bit simpler to understand. They say, where do we find Esther in the Torah? Esther is a Persian name. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah. So the Talmud says, where do we find the name Esther alluded to? And the Talmud says, it says in Deuteronomy 31, on that day my anger will be kindled against them, and I'll forsake them, and I'll hide my face from them, and they shall be devoured, and many evils and troubles shall come upon them, so that they will say in that day, have not these evils come upon us because our God is not among us? That's what they're going to say. And God says, I will surely hide, haster, aster. I will surely hide my face on that day. because they have turned to other gods. The Hebrew haster aster, the Talmud says, this is an allusion to Esther. And this we could all relate to, easier than the tree story with Haman, because the existence of divine wrath or suffering is a product of God hiding his face. When God's face is shining, like we say, shine your countenance upon us, embrace us, that's a time of love. When God or we turn away from each other, that's a sign of disconnect. So when God says, I'll hide my face about times of suffering coming about, but nevertheless he's still there, that's an allusion to Esther. And then we have another one about Mordechai. Mordechai is alluded to with the words used for incense, more drawer. Okay, so I just wanted to pick that one Esther one, but I brought the other two. But this is, in other words, finding an allusion, a prophecy, so to speak, or a prediction of in the 5 books to the name Esther. The story of Esther, we already have other allusions to in other places, going back to the very first covenant between the pieces, when Abraham has a vision of all the different exiles, and there are many other allusions to these great events that happen. And in general, I know this is a slightly off topic, but we say the deeds of our forefathers are signposts for their children. Everything that the patriarchs go through in Genesis is seen as setting the model and being writ small, that which will later on be writ large in the story of the Jewish people. So Abraham goes down to Egypt and his wife is kidnapped and Pharaoh gets plagues, and then Pharaoh lets Abraham and Sarah go with great wealth. That's a precursor for the Jews going down to Egypt and Pharaoh being stricken with 10 plagues and the Jews leaving with great wealth. Esau, the angel struggling with Jacob, and Jacob is wounded, is an allusion to the different challenges the Jewish people have without getting into details. Okay, so at the end of each section, I'm going to pause for breath and then ask for some thoughts. Okay, so here's a very famous allusion in the text. Because God's name is not mentioned explicitly in the text, there's even more reason to say this. But the Talmud, the Midrash says, and it's brought down also in Kabbalistic literature, early Kabbalistic literature, that when it says in the Megillah, the king, it can be read in a dual way. So already in the Talmud, they're saying this, that the word Hamelach, this is reading number 2, can be read as both profane or it can be read as holy. In other words, there are words in the Bible like Adonai, master, which can either mean a physical master or it can mean God. It's not always clear. Like Elohim can sometimes mean God, or it can mean angels, or it can mean judges, or it can mean the powerful. So there are rules about writing a Torah. You have to know, is this considered a holy name of God, or is it a secular, in other words, a non-holy name referring to some other entity? But be that what it may, the tradition is that the 166 times that the word Hamelech is mentioned in Megillah can be read as an allusion to God himself. So I'm just going to read one verse like that, a very famous one. If you remember from last week, we showed that the axis upon which the entire Megillah turns, where it switches from being one of suffering and persecution and God hiding his face to deliverance, is when the king cannot sleep and he calls for the book of records to be read to him, and in it they find that Mordechai had saved the life of the king and had not yet been rewarded. We traditionally in the synagogue, when we read the Megillah, we lift up our voice when we say, Balaylahu, and that night the king could not sleep. So we lift up our voice because this is the main strength, beginning strength, main strength of the miracle, the transformation. The flipping over, which describes the entire story of Megillah, begins to flip. That's the tipping point. You want to know the tipping point? That night. That's where it happens. So the sages read that Vahamelech as an alternative reading. In other words, it's true if the king Achashverosh could not sleep, but there's something else. There's a metaphor in the Torah used many times in Psalms. We say, oh God, awaken. Why do you sleep, God? Now, God doesn't sleep. He doesn't need his shadai, but rather to us, it seems like God is sleeping when we do not see his providence being felt in our life. Hello, God, where have you gone? Have you forsaken us? Where have you gone? So this is what we call God sleeping. Now, God forbid God doesn't, right? He's just hiding or feels disconnected. But when God re-engages in our destiny in a way that we can see it, we call that God awakening. So the nighttime, which represents exile and darkness, just like in Abraham's first vision, where great darkness falls upon him and he sees all these different things, that represents exile. So we say, Balaylahu, in that dark night of exile, when Haman and the mortal king Achashverosh are planning and plotting to wipe out the Jewish people, there's a stirring above. Nadash Nas Hamelech, the sleeping of the divine, so to speak, finds no rest. God is having a sleepless night, fitful. He is awakening from his slumber. What does that mean? Metaphor, going back to allegory. Whenever we talk about God in the Torah, it's allegory. God on his throne, God lifting up his arm. For God, it's always anthropomorphic. It's always allegory. But here we're saying, and we're reading that true, Achashverosh can't sleep, but there's a higher, deeper spiritual reality that God himself, so to speak, cannot sleep. So again, the Hamelech, scattered throughout different works, you have different interpretations. But I would say the core energy behind that, of course, is that the Megillah does not have an explicit reference to God in the entire book. Okay, let's take a little break here before we move to the next one. And I want only questions that are relevant for comprehension. At the end, we could do one to go more on tangents. If I'm not being clear about something, please feel free to speak up. Okay. Now, another little theme, a little motif, which I don't want to spend too much time on, but really it's very hard to ignore. And it's relevant for where we're going to go a little bit crazy at the end of this class, a little bit current events, not too current, but current enough. If you look at the story of Purim as it was understood by the sages, based on how they instituted the mitzvah of reading the Megillah, the codification of the law was that you would read the Shabbat before about Amalek, the ancient enemies of the Jews attacking the Jewish people, and you would read the Haftorah, the selection from the prophets on that Shabbat of the failed attempt of Saul to finish off that mortal enemy of the Jewish people. And the traditional reading of the Megillah, where we say Haman is an Agagite, the understanding is that he is a descendant of that king Agag, these tribes of Amalekites that as the Jews came out, they attacked the Jewish people according to tradition. They did terrible things to the Jews. They raped the males and castrated them and threw their reproductive organs to heaven, as if to deny the covenant. We find this later where God, which Samuel says explicitly in the text, like you have made other mothers bereaved, so too you will be. And he also does to him, so to speak, kills him in a very brutal manner. But the rabbis understood that Purim, Haman is an Agagite, like the text says, but they understood it as being not a Persian word, but related to the biblical Agag, a spiritual or rather physical descendant. Others today maybe, Others may take a less literal approach, but I would say the sages saw Agag being related. And we trace Mordechai to the Kishites, to Saul's father. So Mordechai is a Benjaminite from the same tribe as Saul. A matter of fact, we trace him to Saul's father, who is Kish, and we trace Haman to the arch nemesis, who is Agag. My point of bringing this up is from the traditional perspective, this war that Haman had to eradicate the Jewish people was a war going on for a long time. It was this hatred that existed from the beginning. So I'm not going to read the whole text here, but the Talmud basically says that the debate that Esther has with the sages about writing down the Megillah was seen as a question: should the Megillah be included in the canon or not? The sages did not. If you look at the text in the biblical text of the prophets of the writings of Esther, you see that she writes about the holiday, and she writes again a second letter. The tradition understood that she was trying to convince the sages of the Sanhedrin to make the Book of Esther part of the canon. And one of the reasons why they don't want to, they say it's going to cause anti-Semitism. You guys took revenge against those trying to kill you. If you're living among the Gentiles, don't promote this. And Esther tries to prove, and does prove from biblical text, that it's important to recognize that miracle. But then they say, but writing down to remember what Amalek did, we already have biblical text that it should only be done 3 times. And it's once in Deuteronomy, once in Exodus, and once in the book of Samuel. And she proves, no, it should be a 4th time, that you guys are supposed to include one more book in the canon. In other words, she's talking to the men of the Great Assembly, Sanhedrin, which is or beginning of the Second Temple period. Be that what it may, the idea that the Book of Esther is intimately related to the Amalekites and their war against the Jews, and how the Jews at the end stand up to protect their lives and don't take any booty. They just want to protect their lives from these enemies that are fighting them, is seen as a central theme, though, about this going through Jewish history of the Agagites and the Amalekites, rather. So here is one allusion. I know I don't want to spend too much time, but it's a great line in the Megillah. I'm going to make this a drop larger because here it's not showing up so large. Bear with me for a moment. Let's see if it shows up. Beautiful. So the biblical text explicitly links Haman to the Agagites and Mordechai to Saul by linking him to Kish, a man of Benjamin. Ish Yemini. You see the second verse here. The name of Saul on the left, where the man from Benjamin, name was Kish, son of Abiel, son of Tzur, son of Bechor, son of Abias, son of a Benjaminite. And then we say it was a Jewish man, the fortress Shusha, his name was Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. So the Kish name is related here to, this is the father of Saul. So it's being related to the father of Saul. But the amazing line is when Esther, and there's other allusions, but we don't have to get too caught up in it. What's amazing is, and I've always loved this line, is that when Mordechai is talking to Esther and trying to convince her, he says, if you stand up, if you choose not to stand up for the Jewish people, salvation will come from somewhere else. But you, Ba'at, you, Ubeis Avich, and your father's house, Tovedu, will be lost. What does that mean? You and your father's house will be lost. So literally it means you have an opportunity. Step up to what you've been given, because God doesn't, if you don't want to be the messenger, God has many messengers. But it's your destiny that you can fulfill your destiny. But the sages say there's a deeper element here. The deeper element is, Saul had not killed Agag, and Agag had escaped. Or not, he didn't escape, I'm sorry. He impregnated a maid woman who escaped, a slave woman who escaped, and became the future ancestor of Haman, who inherited this irrational hatred for the Jewish people that were now threatening to wipe out all the Jews. So Mordecai is telling Esther, you and your father's household, you have the ability to rectify this, the Saul dropping the ball. You have the ability now to save the Jewish people from the mistake of your ancestor. If you don't, you've lost God will take care of us. But you have an opportunity to fix that which your ancestor messed up. This idea that one could fix, so to speak, where an ancestor dropped the ball existed in other places as well. But here it's very beautiful. At, the last line, Ubei Savich Tovedu. You know, and Saul dropped the ball in many different ways, but this was the straw that broke the camel's back. And again, there's language there, very evocative of the Purim story, like where Samuel tells Saul, I'm going to give, God is going to give the kingdom to someone who's better than you. The exact same words used when the king is looking for someone to replace Vashti with someone better than her. Exact same Hebrew words. Doesn't exist anywhere else in the whole Tanakh. Those four words in that structure. So there are many other allusions where you link these stories. This is Remez, but it's Remez is even more in a way than the Joseph story, because in observance, it is for sure seen in tradition as being an extension of Amalek. Now, the reading of the Megillah is read together with the Amalek story and the Haftorah on the Shabbat before they read the Haftorah and of one section of the Torah, and then on Purim Day we read another section of Amalek together with the Megillah, almost like a Haftorah as well. Okay, I'm going to take a break here and talk about Saul for a couple of minutes if anyone wants to. I mean, not Saul in general. Saul and Esther and the allusion to Amalek that's here. Anyone has any questions?
Rabbi, so is the idea, like, not to compare this to literature, because this is the Bible, but in literature, like, it helps us to understand when we compare it to other works. So is that where this idea comes from? Because somebody could say, you know, like Shakespeare, for example, and again, not comparing it at all to Shakespeare, but like someone could say, oh, his stories are, you know, if this works, this formula works, so I'm going to use this formula in another play and change it a little bit, but you're going to have the characters that, you know, because like it seems like a stretch, like comparing Saul to Esther.
Oh, but it's
and Vashti, because like, so like we're talking about.
No, the language there. No, there is the language. The language.
Right, so I'm asking you, like.
Right. It's called literary allusions in literature as well. It's called literary allusions, which pay homage to another text. It's like literature because it is literature too. It's God's word, but it's also literature, and it uses structure of literature, and it makes allusions.
Isn't it a stretch to compare? Like Samuel and Saul to Vashti and Esther?
It's not comparing, it's choosing the language that makes you recognize it. If I say, you know, if you see a cartoon where the kid stands up on his chair and says, give me dessert or give me death, and he's standing there like he's on a ship. In other words, there's an allusion that takes place that helps you make the linkage. In other words, the linkage is not about the dessert, right?
Like liberty or that, right? Because in literature we use allusion a lot in order to, you know,
biblical text does too. Biblical text does too. And I'll say something else. But with the last part, it's not just language usage, which is another whole. Language usage is a mark to the reader. Oh, go look there. It's a hyperlink that says, oh, there's a tenuous connection of these texts, not to every character in the story, but to the text. It's making glue marks. It's making hyperlinks that you go back and forth.
But it's also like they're not characters, like they're real people that.
Absolutely, but whoever wrote it, But the prophet who writes it, Esther and Mordecai, wants you to look at other biblical stories, and therefore the book of Daniel is linked a lot to the book of Esther, and there's a lot of borrowed language. Now, you can say that Esther chose to use, she's of the last of the biblical books, and in order to be accepted, maybe you could argue she chose deliberately. Talking about someone could say that. That doesn't take away from the point that she, as a prophetess, she chose language that already existed in other stories. And we know of the linkage, irrespective of the textual linkage. The idea that he's an Agagite and trying to kill the Jews, I don't need text to tell me that. The tradition tells me that. The words even tell me that. But the linkage helps us see how Esther is fixing everything of this destiny. And it helps us understand the stream of anti-Semitism and irrational hatred that exists through history, and how it keeps up and comes up and comes up again, which will conclude our class with. Thank you. We'll come back to this, though. But I think it's important that these things are not heavy-handed. These are allusions. And I want to say one more element about allusion. Allusions are a bit subjective, and they're not as definitive as other ways, other readings of a text. So I'm going to read we're going to move on now to about the letters and shapes of letters. And the story is told like this, that when Moses goes, this is a story in the Talmud, when Moses is on the mountain, he finds God tying crowns on letters of the Torah. And he says, God, why can't you just give me the Torah? I want to go down and bring the Torah to the Jews. And God said, there's a person who will be born who's going to interpret every jot and tittle, every tag. That's what jot and tittle is. Every crown on the letters, every thorn of these crowns, Akiva, son of Yosef, is going to interpret them, the rabbinic sage that would come later. And Moses goes down, and God shows him a vision, rather, not goes down. Moshe is shown a vision into the future that he's sitting there, and he hears Rabbi Akiva teaching Torah. And Rabbi Akiva is finding allusions in the crowns of letters. And Moshe says, I don't know this stuff. This is all in the story. I don't know this stuff. And then all of a sudden he hears Rabbi Akiva say, all this that I'm teaching you was given to Moses at Sinai. And Moses is comforted. And Moses is comforted because God is going to teach him everything that will be alluded to and hinted to in these letters. And the point is that allusions and shapes of letters and crowns of letters in the Torah and very fine analytical type of extrapolations, as we're going to see, these are all things that can be expanded to a great degree. And the idea, though, is that they're all given in some way, already from the beginning, alluded to in the Torah. God is infinite. His Torah is infinite. There could be many more ways to read a text than one. Not to take away from the literal or from the halachic, but nevertheless there are. Okay, here's a line from Nachmanides. Nachmanides quotes this story, and he says that, here's the line, I'll just read it. Everything that was transmitted to Moses through the 49 gates of understanding was written in the Torah explicitly, or by implication in words, or in the numerical value of the letters, or in the form of the letters. Now, God transmits to Moses, but there are ways that it's alluded to in the text. The text itself is a code upon code upon code of a multiplicity of millions of layers of meaning, because the wisdom of all that will unfold is alluded to in the text. And this is the tips and the crownlets, as our sages have said. Okay. That's the gist of it, the belief that is there. Now, it doesn't mean that every interpretation that you or I come up with is necessarily going to be an accurate representation of what it means. But it does mean there is room to look in that manner. And sometimes we do have traditions. Okay. Here is a famous one, a little bit of a story. We'll go off on a little tangent. It's really not about the Megillah, but it's a very great story. The song of Haazinu, the song of in Deuteronomy 32, where God tells Moses, sing this. Moses tells the Jews to hear this song, and that God wants him to write down this song for future generations, where he draws. He gives them rebuke and predictions of the future. So the same Nachmanides says, you find alluded to in that song all of Jewish history. You find our destruction of the first temple and of the second temple and of our ultimate return with Mashiach in the future. And he says everything is there, and he shows from the text allusions to events in Jewish history. And he said here, even had this Shira been written by one of the astrologers, if God forbid it wasn't part of Torah, some predictor of events had written this, we would believe it because he predicted everything. How much more so it's the Torah of God? Of course, we see it, and we see the prophecies that unfolded about how the Jewish people will be taken by Rome and sent to ships, and they'll be sent as slaves, and no one will buy them. This is actually recorded in the historians of the Roman times, that they couldn't sell Jewish slaves, the market was saturated. And the only time in history where you have that Jews from from Israel to Egypt as slaves was this after the second temple. And God prophesies that the Jews will return to the Holy Land afterwards, and they'll repent, and the Mashiach will come. So all these things are alluded to there. So here's an amazing story. This story is recorded in a book that was written in 1697, and it's about this Nachmanides in 1300. So the story is, and it's in other sources as well, and it was a tradition. I can't say the story is written in the Torah because it happened much after the Torah. So he said, I received a tradition. I'll tell the story in my own words, but you could look at the text as well. The story is the Ramban had a student by the name of Rabbi Avner who changed his religion, and he became a great leader. Some say, in that time, it was the Christians who were ruling the area where Nachmanides was, the kingdom. James of Aragon was the king, and there were bishops, and there were Jews that converted, and he says he became very great. And one day, he sent on Yom Kippur for his former teacher, the Nachmanides, to be brought before him, this bishop or this prince. And as Nachmanides is brought before him on Yom Kippur by guards, the former student slaughters a pig, cooks it, grills it, and eats it. And after he ate it, he says to his former teacher, how many caresses, how many sins that the Torah says my soul's cut off for did I just do? On Yom Kippur, I killed the pig, I roasted it, and I ate it. And the Rav said it was 4. And the student said, I think it was 5. He wanted to get into a rabbinic debate with him. So Nachmanides gives him a harsh look, and he falls silent. He still had a little bit of fear of his teacher. And then he asks him, what brought him? The teacher says, why did you become a heretic? And the student says, it's your fault, Rabbi. You taught this far-fetched teaching that everything can be alluded to in the song of Haazinu. Everything. That's absurd. So that led me to leave the religion. You overshot your bounds. You took too much, and it made me think the whole thing was fake. And Nachmanides said, I still think it's true. So the man said, okay. And Nachmanides says, ask me what you want. So the man says, show me where I am found in the text. And Nachmanides went to a corner and prayed, and a verse came into his mouth. And the verse in Hebrew is Amarti. I said, Af Ahem, I will make an end of them. This is God talking about the Jewish people who are sinning. Ashpisa, I will Enosh Zichram, I will make the memory cease from among men. That's a verse. Now, if you look here at the highlighted, Amarti, the Resh, Reb, Af Am, Aleph, Bet, Nun, Resh. Reb Avner. The third letter of each of those words spells out his name, Reb Avner. The man, his face, he turned white, and he realized that God had answered his teacher's prayer, and he saw his name. His name is alluded to in that very verses that talk about the destruction, about those who sin and rebel against God. And he said, is there any cure to my hurt? And the Rav said, it says in the text itself what your solution is. It says, may the memory cease from among men. And the Rav left. And the man took a boat. Either it said, one place it says a boat, a black boat. Here it says a boat without sailors or oars. In other words, with a mast and sails, but no oars, wherever the wind took him, and no more was known of him. So here it was a biblical allusion to this man. The Torah, with its 300,000 letters, can have allusions to many, many things. Here it was found this specific person. The Rebbe gave, as was his wont, a more positive interpretation. The Rebbe said, I skipped it. Okay, I must have. The Rebbe said, if you look at his name, already in the biblical text, it has, what's the first letter? The Resh. The Resh stands for rabbi. Why is he Reb, not rabbi, Reb? Why is he called Reb, an honorific? Because he was going to do tshuva. Already from the beginning, his repentance is also encoded in the Torah. And he would be able to teach us how repentance, no matter how far you go, is never too far gone. One could always return. Now, this is going to lead us to, I'm not going to have time to talk about, let me just do these at least a little bit. Gematria, numeric value, is another technique of Torah interpretation. Now, again, you can't go and you can't make up your own gematrias about things that are not related, but if they support certain ideas that you have already, then it's a spice to the dish. It's not seen as proving things. Although there are some biblical texts where we use gematria, same word as geometry, which is numbers, is the numeric value of letters. A very ancient code. Jews write numbers with letters. So if you look here, Aleph is 1, Beis is 2, till Yud is 10, and then you have 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, and then you have 200, 300, 400. So all of our dates in Hebrew, we use these letters to make the dates. So I'm going to skip down by accident. I moved that by accident. We find, I'll skip this one because it's not as interesting, but there are lots of gematrias throughout the Torah. Again, it's the spice of Torah. So I want to spend 4 minutes on this, although this itself was going to be the core of the class, but just because of time, I'm just going to. This was relevant for today because the Ramosha Isserlis, he had to flee Krakow because of an epidemic. And they ended up in the middle of nowhere in Poland where there was no food and they were hungry. It's a wealthy family and they had been forced out because the air was polluted. Basically, there was an epidemic. And there was no food for Purim. They had nothing, maybe a little bit of bread. There was no Purim meal. There was no nothing. How do you send gifts of food when nobody has bread to eat? So he wrote a book. He composed a book while he was there. He was 17 years old. This rabbi, he died at 37, according to many opinions. I was at his grave in Krakow, but he is the main rabbi for Jewish law for Ashkenazic Jewry. For all of Ashkenazic Jewry, the Ramah, Ramosha Isilis, is the counterpoint to Rabbi Yosef Karo and the codifier of the Book of Jewish law. But so he was a great rabbi, but he also wrote as a young man this book where the whole Megillah could be read as a metaphor for humanity's struggles. I will do it maybe in 5 sentences. And the struggle is like this. He interprets like this. Everything's a metaphor, okay? This is not literal. No one get upset if it doesn't fit literally, but it fits into the words in Hebrew. In Hebrew, he finds a relationship between each one of these people. But I'll put it like this. The king Achashverosh is our soul, our intellectual soul, our ability to think. Persia and Media refer to intellect and emotions. Princes and servants are your senses and limbs of the body. Beautiful maidens are good attributes. Vashti refers to our own inclination towards materialism. Esther refers to our the refined nature of the person who wants holier things. Mordechai represents the good inclination. In other words, Vashti and Esther are connected to the body. Mordechai and Haman are connected to the inclinations. And the tree represents the Torah, the tree of life. And he reads it like this. That in the 3rd year, and here are the periods of the 3 periods of the Megillah. One period is our youth. The next period is our maturity. And the 3rd period is our old age. In the 3rd year of ruling, he makes a feast for all the people, King Achashverosh, for 180 days. The 180 represents 180 degrees under the sky that we live on this earth. And a person who follows, as young people are wont to do at times, the journey begins with people following their passions. And they have all sorts of meals and all sorts of vessels. And all they care about is not using their head for good holy things, but for indulgence. They take, what is the king doing? He's indulging. What do we use our mind for in this motif of our life? We look for pursuit of pleasure. And then at a certain point, and not just that, what happens is at the feast, it says, you're not forced to drink. Anyone can drink what they want. God doesn't force us to choose good or evil. He gives us freedom of choice. And we choose. And then we have a choice there about Vashti, where what happens is, according to this version of the parable, as a metaphor, is that what happens is the more we sin, the harder it is to get out. We slip, like it says in Deuteronomy, pouring water upon the thirsty. What happens is that when we indulge ourselves in the permissible and then in the immoral and then the illegal, we keep on pushing the boundaries. And at a certain point, we are told you have to get rid of that, wake up, mature, get your life in order, and you got to choose from beautiful maidens, from good attributes. And we do. We mature, and we wake up, and we try to live a life of purpose. But even there's temptation. The guardians at the door are alluded to are our imagination. We get temptation coming from different places. And when we have temptation, how do we have to deal with it? We have to hang it on a tree, the tree of life, the Torah. How do we deal with our eyes, like we say, being led adrift after wrong, negative things? We hang it on the tree of Torah. So they were hung, Big Sun and Seresh, guardians of the door, representing our senses. But then what happens, comes along the Haman and tempts the person, the evil inclination, tempts the person and says, there's one nation scattered. Why are you Jews doing the Torah mitzvahs? It's difficult. Look at your buddy who's successful. He doesn't keep the Shabbat, he doesn't keep kosher, he assimilates. Be like Harry, be like Joe, be like Mo. Don't be Mordechai, Yosef. Don't be a Jew. And he also says there's also persecution. You guys are scattered. So the Haman tells the evil inclination, in other words, in the beginning, it's just the coarseness of the body. A young child, youth, wants pleasure. But here it becomes, this desire for the 10,000 talents of silver. We want money. As you mature, you want financial stability. And if it means throwing my Judaism out, like the king says to Haman, keep your money. What this message is that we say, you know what? It's not just about the money. The reality is keeping Judaism is a bit difficult. I don't want to do Judaism. Keep the money. And then what happens is the fasting and the prayer and the repentance. So it leads to Mordechai, which is perfected. So the idea of Mordechai riding on the horse, later on, Mordechai getting the signet ring is when a person has overcome all these internal challenges and has become a settled, perfected person. So again, this is an overview of a whole book. This is a book review in 8 minutes. And he wrote it as a young man, and it's a mix of philosophy and Kabbalah. Whether one accepts this as being what Moses had been taught as well at Sinai is up to you. But the messages that he draws, he's pulling from many rich sources of Jewish tradition and the Torah as a whole about how we deal with challenges. But it's just beautiful in many ways where he has these very nice insights. Okay, now we get to the kicker. This is a bit of a mind blower. This mind blower is in the Megillah, just like in the Torah, there are big letters and small letters. So if you see here, and I'm going to try to do it without making it, you guys see the red marker? Oh, good. So right here, this letter here, Chor, is talking about the party, and it's a large ches. If you see, it's larger than all the other letters, okay? Ches, a regular ches, let me show you a regular ches. A regular ches is going to be right over here. It's about half the size. This is the large ches. There's a few large letters, a few small ones. Every large letter in the Torah is an allusion to something. Every small letter is an allusion. So this is by the party. So one interpretation is that and this is, every Megillah has this. Every Megillah that we've ever found has this, because there are traditions in codexes about how to write it. Some of it's in the Talmud, some is not. Some is just in codexes. The Aleppo Codex, we have the Leningrad Codex. These are old documents that are called the Masoretic text, which is how we write Torahs, based on these documents that tell you how to write, how to spell, and what letters to make big and small. So Ches is the number 8, and it's seen as representing the 8 garb of the high priest. There's another one, another big letter, because according to the rabbinic tradition, Achashverosh, like Belshazzar, got dressed up as the high priest because he was celebrating the fact that the Jews were not returning to Israel. That's that interpretation. Then we have here a large tuf, Vatichtov Esther, and Esther wrote. Some say it's because it's the 22nd letter of the Torah, and she's the 22nd woman righteous woman that's alluded to in Eshet Chayil, a woman of valor. We read 22 verses, and each verse refers to another woman of valor in the Torah. Some say, but different interpretations. But a fascinating thing happened. In the challenge of Purim is, Purim, we got saved. You know what? There have been other horrific events in Jewish history where we were not saved. With the story of Purim, we didn't get God reaching down and saving us. And whenever we did get God saving us, people made mini Purims. So there was always this concept that Purim represents salvation. There are tens of mini Purims that are based on locales. Different locales have a Purim, their own Purim for their family, for their town, different dates, whenever miraculous events happen. But one of the fascinating subtexts, and this is already from 1648, when the Kaminsky Massacre happened and were destroyed before the Holocaust, that was the most vicious event in since the destruction of the temple, more than the Crusades. hundreds of thousands, depends how you count, 1,000 villages decimated by these Cossacks who are rebelling against their Polish overlords and deciding to kill the Jews as well. Today in the Ukraine, they may even make this man into a hero. But be that what it may, they see him as a fighter for independence. But on the way, massacred tremendous amounts of Jews. And these two letters, Tuf and Ches, if we go back to the Gematria for a minute, 1648, just to look for a moment, I'll show you in a minute. But look, just 16, this year, our year now, is Tuf Shin Pei Aleph, 5781 in the Hebrew letters. The Hebrew year for 1648 is Tuf and Ches, the large Tuf and the large Ches. And a sage living in that year, when it happened, he said this is referring to our time in the Megillah. Even though the decree was lifted for the Jews of Purim, we are getting the decree, Tuf and Ches, 1648. And now comes an amazing thing. This is the Kaminsky Massacre, and you had all these the priests there. You know, it was a mixture of things, religion and politics and hatred of Jews. But either way, now here's an amazing thing. I make this a bit larger because, okay, here we have, and we'll see it in this one a little better. We have a small Suf. We have a small Shin. We have a very large Vav. And we have a small Zion. So look at this. I'm going to show you here. Here, a Suf, a small Shin, a small Zion, and a very large Vav. Okay? These are all the abnormal letters in the Megillah. And again, people have given interpretations through the ages. The idea that there are people that have irrational hatred for Jews, we see that as spiritually being descendants of Amalek. If someone's willing to kill themselves to kill a Jew, that's Amalek. Whether they're physically children of Amalek or spiritual descendants of Amalek, that is Amalek. If you're willing to lose the war against the Allies to kill more Jews in a concentration camp, that's Amalek. But in the Talmud, written 1,500 years ago, they speak of that the descendants of Esau is seen as, whether spiritual or physical is another conversation, is Rome. And then he translates, Germania, this is in the Talmud, Germania of Edom, Germany, which is near Italy, near Rome. If they would unify, if Germany and Italy would get together, they would destroy the world. They would destroy the Jewish people. The only ally that Germany did not break Italy was a very close ally of Germany. And this is in the Talmud. They say if Germania and Italy got together, this is the muzzle that is holding back Edom from destroying the Jews. This is what it says in the Talmud. But wait, the Nuremberg Trials. The Nuremberg Trials, you know how many people were killed at Nuremberg? 10. 10 were killed. There were 11. One committed suicide the night before Goring by drinking poison. Now listen to this. Aside from the fact that the hangman's name was Wood, wait to this. In the papers, they recorded what Streicher was a Jewish the Schrummer's editor, and he was an expert on Judaism. He had written about Purim before. He knew what Purim was, but it was predominant in his mind as the Allies sentenced them to hanging. The French said, what do you mean? They're war criminals. War criminals, you give them a firing squad. What are you doing? What are you doing with hanging? But they decide to give them hanging. And just by the way, in the Megillah itself, it's very strange. In the Megillah, Esther asks for, after Haman's sons are killed, she asks, can we hang Haman's sons? Why are you hanging them? They're dead already. And there are different interpretations. It was to show they were rebelling against the king. It was everyone should see and they shouldn't fight with the Jews and keep trying to kill them. It was supposed to ward off the enemies from fighting. But if you look at the language, it's very strange. You're killing them twice? And look at this. This is what he says. Streicher, this is quote Daily News, Newsweek. You can look it up. New York Times, you can look it up. Streicher was stopped immediately inside the door by 2 army sergeants who closed in on each side and held his arms. Streicher's scream of Heil Hitler sent a shiver down the back of this correspondent who was witnessing the executions as sole representative of the American press. As its echo died away, another American colonel stood standing by the scaffold, said, "Ask the man his name." Streicher said, "You know my name well." He repeated it, and the man shouted. Guards then started moving Streicher up the steps. As he mounted the platform, the beady-eyed Jew hater called out, "And now it goes to God." He was swung around to face the audience in front of him. He glared at Allied officers and 8 Allied correspondents. With burning hatred in his eyes, his last words, he shouted, "Purim Fest 1946. He said this. He said Purim Fest 1946. Haman's son's being hung. And then he says the Bolsheviks will hang you guys one of these days. Going back, the Hebrew year, these letters, this is how you write it. Just like we write this year, 5781, the way we write 1946 in Hebrew, the Hebrew year, which would be 57, it was then, it was 5707. Let's take a look here. 5707 in the Hebrew year with Tuf Shin Zion. And the large 6, the large Vav is 6. This large Vav is 6. Either it's the 6th millennium, because the way we write numbers, I'm not writing 5,781 this year. I write Tuf Shin, which is 781, because you can't make 5,000 in Hebrew. It would take too many letters. It would take Tuf 10 times to write 4,000. So we write a symbol. Vav is either 6 for the 6 million or 6 for the 6th millennium. Which again, I'm not one to predict the past. Just an amazing contemporary allusion in a text where, again, if he wouldn't have said it, all right. An interesting thing is there were 11 and 1 committed suicide. According to rabbinic tradition, Vashti had a daughter, Haman had a daughter as well, and she committed suicide. She jumped from the roof. Long story, but it's a midrash, it's a rabbinic tradition. And either way, without getting too detailed, Goring was a cross-dresser. That's another conversation. The point only is, and there are many, many other allusions in this story about this event. Now, I'm not going to say, I'm not a prophet, but I can just say, we believe, going back to Nachmanides, that in the Torah is alluded to every event that will ever happen. Every person, or to the Jewish people. Even individuals are alluded to. How much more so an event like this? And this is the big question, of course. How do we celebrate Purim today? When, after the Holocaust, I know my grandfather had 3 daughters. My mother, my Aunt Judy, and then a girl born during the war, right at the beginning. He named her Esther, hoping that the miracle would happen for them, like it happened for the Jews way back in that story. It was not to be. For them, it was. They were saved. It wasn't for the Jewish people. Matter of fact, right not long after that, my grandfather, he was in Hungary, and he walked in. He had relatives, kids that were put into a labor camp. The way it worked, the Hungarian Nazis put them first in labor camps or internment camps, not labor camps, internment camps. My grandfather was a Hungarian citizen. These 2 kids were not. He walked into the labor camp. It was Purim. He walked into the labor camp. He took the 2 kids. He acted like he knew what he was doing and he was in charge. And he marched out holding these 2 kids who survived the whole way these relatives of mine remember my grandfather, who was a young man then, was saying the Megillah by heart, saying the Megillah word for word, singing it in the tune that would be sung in the synagogue as they walked through the streets, avoiding the black guards or the different names of the Nazi sympathizers that were then in Hungary at the time, and got into safety. And ultimately, they survived the war. And they remember my grandfather walking through the streets, telling them, just listen to me as we say the story, don't look around, as he's saying softly then the story of Esther. But the great question, of course, is how do we celebrate? How did Jews after the war, celebrate Purim? It's the anti-Purim in a way. And this leads, to serious questions of this, that the salvation of Purim was not a final one. It was not. We're still in exile. And we're exiled after the Jews went back to the Second Temple, and then it was made impure by the Greeks, and later on we were destroyed by the Romans, and we're in exile today. And we're looking forward to the ultimate redemption, where we say at that point will be the true fulfillment of the Purim story, when everything will be transformed into good. Ora, Simcha, Sasan, Vikar, for real, for good, permanent. Okay,